At a dusty county fair auction, a gaunt stallion with a dull coat stood ignored in the corner pen, dismissed by everyone as worthless. Not a single bidder showed interest, except for one weathered rancher who recognized something in those tired eyes that everyone else missed. When he brought the horse home for next to nothing, what happened in the months that followed left the entire community speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The blistering August sun beat down on the fairgrounds. Its harsh rays reflecting off the metal roofs of temporary stalls that housed livestock for auction. Dust swirled through the air, kicked up by the constant movement of boots and hooves alike. The Willow Creek County Fair was in full swing, drawing farmers, ranchers, and traders from across 3 states. Jackson Reed wiped sweat from his brow as he wandered between the auction pens. At 42, his face was etched with lines earned. From years working outdoors, his skin permanently tanned from endless days under the open sky. Unlike the other ranchers who traveled in groups, laughing and discussing potential purchases, Jackson moved alone, observing more than speaking. He wasn't actually planning to buy anything today. His ranch, Hillcrest, was struggling to stay afloat after 3 years of drought had decimated his cattle operation. The last thing he needed was another mouth to feed. Yet something had drawn him to the auction. Perhaps nostalgia, perhaps the simple human need for connection after too many solitary days mending fences and calculating dwindling finances. The main auction ring buzzed with energy. A magnificent quarter horse pranced in circles as the auctioneer rattled off bids that climbed higher and higher. Men in pressed shirts and polished boots nodded imperceptibly as the price surged beyond what most working ranchers could justify. 17,000 going once, going twice, sold to Mr. Davidson, the auctioneer announced triumphantly, his voice carrying through the speakers. Jackson shook his head slightly. The horse was beautiful, no doubt, but breeding and bloodlines had driven the price beyond reason. He turned away from the main arena, wandering toward the periphery, where smaller pens housed animals waiting their turn. That's when he saw him. A stallion standing alone in a corner pen. Unlike the other horses who paced restlessly or whinnied for attention, this one stood unnaturally still. His ribs protruded beneath a dull, patchy coat. One of his legs bore a faded scar, and his head hung low, almost as if he'd resigned himself to whatever fate awaited. Jackson paused, something about the animal catching his attention. Despite the horse's poor condition, there was a quiet dignity in his stance, an almost imperceptible alertness in his eyes that didn't match his defeated posture. 2 men in cowboy hats leaned against the fence nearby, glancing occasionally at the horse. "That one's barely worth the gas it would take to haul him to the rendering plant," the taller one remarked with a dismissive chuckle. "Heard he came from that foreclosure on the Bowman place," his companion replied. "Old man died. Bank seized everything. Horse was half-starved when they found him. Probably been neglected for months." "Waste of auction space if you ask me," the first man said. "Who'd want a broken-down nag like that?" Jackson felt a flicker of irritation at their callousness. He moved closer to the pen, deliberately placing himself between the men and the horse. The stallion's ears twitched slightly at his approach, but otherwise showed no reaction. Up close, Jackson could see the animal's true condition was even worse than it appeared from a distance. Beyond the obvious malnutrition, there were small scars around his muzzle and flanks that spoke of past mistreatment. Yet when Jackson looked into the horse's eyes, he didn't see fear or aggression, just a weathered patience, an endurance that resonated with something deep within him. "Hey there," Jackson said softly, extending his hand slowly toward the fence. The horse watched him for a long moment before taking a tentative step forward. He stretched his neck, nostrils flaring as he caught Jackson's scent. There was caution in his movement, but not fear, a distinction that didn't escape Jackson's notice. "What's his story?" Jackson asked, turning toward a young auction worker who was refilling water troughs. The young man glanced up. "That one? Name's Thunder, according to his papers, though he sure doesn't live up to it now. 7 years old, no registered bloodline. Previous owner died about 6 months back, and looks like nobody bothered much with the animals until the bank took over. Been passed around since then." "Any issues besides the obvious?" Jackson asked, his eyes tracking the faded scar on the horse's leg. "Old injury on his right foreleg. Vet cleared him as sound enough, but nobody's expecting much from him." The worker shrugged. "Honestly, he'll probably go for meat price if anyone bids at all." Jackson nodded his thanks as the worker moved on. He remained by the pen, studying the horse that everyone else had written off. There was something about the animal's quiet resilience that pulled at him, reminding him of his own struggles to keep going when everything seemed stacked against him. The economic downturn had hit his ranch hard. After losing his wife, Maria, to cancer 5 years earlier, Jackson had thrown himself into work. But the drought had been merciless. He'd had to sell off half his cattle last year just to make mortgage payments. The ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations was hanging by a thread. "You and me both, buddy," he murmured to the horse. "World's written us both off, hasn't it?" The stallion's eyes met his, and in that moment Jackson made a decision that defied all logic and financial sense. Hours later, as the day's main attractions concluded, the remaining animals were brought forth for quick sale. When Thunder was led out, the auctioneer barely mustered enthusiasm. "Next we have a 7-year-old stallion, no papers. Bidding starts at $200. Do I hear 200? The arena fell silent. A few people glanced up and quickly returned to their conversations, disinterested. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Jackson raised his hand. "I have 200, the auctioneer announced, sounding almost surprised. "Do I hear 250? No other bids came. After a perfunctory going once, going twice, the gavel fell, sold for $200. As Jackson approached to handle the paperwork, he caught snippets of conversation around him. Poor fool, just bought himself a problem. What's Reed thinking? His place is barely hanging on as it is. That horse is one strong wind away from the glue factory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jackson signed the papers without comment, his weathered hands steady despite the doubts suddenly swirling in his mind. What was he doing? He couldn't afford another mouth to feed, especially one that might never provide any return. Yet something, instinct, compassion, or perhaps simple stubbornness, pushed him forward. Loading Thunder into his trailer proved easier than expected. The horse followed without resistance, his compliance born not of training, but of resignation. As Jackson secured the trailer door, he wondered if he'd just made the worst financial decision of his already precarious situation. The drive back to Hillcrest Ranch was long and quiet, giving Jackson ample time to question his impulse. The radio played softly, old country songs about hard times and perseverance that seemed to mock his current predicament. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the drought-stricken landscape, highlighting the yellowed pastures that had once been verdant feeding grounds for his cattle. When he finally turned onto the gravel road leading to his property, Jackson felt a strange mix of dread and determination. The ranch house came into view, a modest two-story structure weathered by time but still standing proud. Behind it spread the barns, corrals, and outbuildings that comprised the heart of Hillcrest's operations. As he parked near the main barn, his ranch hand, Miguel, emerged from the tack room. The older man had worked at Hillcrest for over 20 years, staying loyal even when Jackson could barely afford to pay him. "Didn't expect you back with company," Miguel remarked, eyeing the trailer curiously. "Neither did I," Jackson admitted, climbing down from his truck. "But here we are." Together they opened the trailer, and Thunder stepped cautiously onto Hillcrest soil. In the fading daylight, his poor condition was even more apparent, causing Miguel to raise his eyebrows. "Jefe," he said slowly, using the nickname he'd called Jackson for years, "what exactly did you pay for this horse?" "200, Jackson replied, leading Thunder toward an empty stall in the barn. Miguel whistled low. "Even that might be steep. What were you thinking?" It was a fair question, one Jackson wasn't sure he could answer. "I don't know, Miguel. Something about him. I couldn't just leave him there." Miguel's expression softened. He'd known Jackson long enough to understand that beneath his practical exterior beat a heart that sometimes overruled his head. It was the same heart that had kept Miguel and his family employed, even when finances suggested Jackson should let them go. "Well," Miguel said with a resigned smile, "I suppose we've faced worse challenges." They settled Thunder into a clean stall with fresh water and a small portion of hay. Jackson was careful not to overfeed him, knowing that a starved horse couldn't handle too much food at once. As they worked, he explained what little he knew of Thunder's background. "Abandoned when his owner died," Jackson concluded. "Nobody bothered to check on the animals for weeks, apparently." Miguel shook his head, his weathered face creased with disapproval. "Some people don't deserve to keep animals." He reached out cautiously to stroke Thunder's neck. The horse allowed the touch, but remained distant, as if he'd learned not to expect kindness. That night, after Miguel had gone home to his family in the small cottage at the edge of the property, Jackson sat alone on his porch with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The financial ledgers spread before him told a grim story, one that made his impulsive purchase seem even more foolish. The ranch was 3 months behind on loan payments. The reduced herd meant reduced income, creating a downward spiral that seemed impossible to escape. The drought had driven feed prices up, while forcing cattle prices down. On paper, Hillcrest Ranch was a failing business. Jackson closed the ledger with a sigh. His father and grandfather had weathered hard times on this land before him. They'd faced dust storms, floods, and market crashes, and somehow they'd always found a way through. But for the first time, Jackson wasn't sure if determination alone would be enough. As moonlight spilled across the porch, he thought about Thunder standing alone in that auction pen. Perhaps he'd seen something of himself in those resigned eyes. Something that refused to give up even when all logic said it was time to surrender. "We're both survivors," he murmured into the night. "Now we just need to figure out how to do more than survive." In the weeks that followed, Jackson established a careful routine for Thunder's rehabilitation. Each morning before dawn, he would check on the horse, providing small, frequent meals to slowly rebuild his strength without overwhelming his system. Miguel researched dietary supplements that might help restore Thunder's coat and muscle mass. They couldn't afford the premium options, but they created a mix of ground flaxseed, vitamins, and minerals that seemed to help. Jackson added it to Thunder's feed, noticing how the horse began to watch for his arrival, ears perking up slightly when footsteps approached his stall. Progress was painfully slow. 2 weeks in, Thunder still looked skeletal, though his eyes had begun to show more alertness. His coat remained dull, and he moved with caution, as if conserving what little energy he possessed. The turning point came unexpectedly one morning, as Jackson was mucking out Thunder's stall. Lost in thought about the bank notice that had arrived the previous day, he didn't notice when he dropped his work glove. Thunder stretched his neck forward, picked up the glove with surprising gentleness, and held it out toward Jackson. The simple act stopped Jackson in his tracks. It wasn't just the helpfulness, it was the intelligence behind the gesture, the clear evidence that Thunder was observing and processing his environment in ways typical horses didn't. "Well, thank you," Jackson said, accepting the glove with a surprised smile. Thunder watched him, something new flickering in his gaze, a tentative connection forming between man and horse. That evening, Jackson mentioned the incident to Miguel, who nodded thoughtfully. "My grandfather had a saying," Miguel offered as they leaned against the corral fence, watching Thunder cautiously explore his expanded territory. "He said some horses carry wisdom in their bones, not just training or instinct, but true understanding." He gestured toward Thunder. "Perhaps this one is such a horse." Jackson wasn't sure he believed in such things, but he couldn't deny that Thunder seemed different from other horses he'd known. Over the following days, he began spending more time simply being near the horse, not working with him or expecting anything, just sharing space and building trust. One afternoon, a month after bringing Thunder home, Jackson sat on an overturned bucket in the corner of the corral, reviewing yet another threatening letter from the bank. Thunder, who had been grazing at the far end, slowly made his way over and stood beside him. Without prompting, the horse lowered his head and gently nudged Jackson's shoulder as if offering comfort. Jackson looked up, meeting those intelligent eyes. "You understand more than you let on, don't you?" Thunder nickered softly, the warmest sound Jackson had heard from him yet. It was around this time that Jackson's neighbor and longtime friend, Sarah Mitchell, dropped by unexpectedly. A veterinarian who specialized in large animals, Sarah had been checking in periodically since hearing about Jackson's rescue case. "I was in the area," she explained, though they both knew Hillcrest wasn't in the area of anything. Sarah had been helping Jackson for months, offering free veterinary care and occasionally bringing supplies she claimed were extras from her practice, though Jackson suspected she was simply covering the costs herself. They walked to the corral together, where Thunder was enjoying the late autumn sunshine. "Well," Sarah said, her professional assessment mixing with genuine surprise, "he's certainly improving. His weight is still low, but that coat is starting to get some shine back." She studied the horse with practiced eyes. "You know, under all that neglect, there might actually be quite a remarkable animal." "What makes you say that?" Jackson asked, curious about her professional opinion. Sarah pointed out Thunder's conformation, the proportions and angles of his body that horse people analyzed to assess potential. "His bone structure is excellent. Look at the shoulder angle, the depth of his chest, and those legs. Once he builds muscle, They'll be strong. Whoever bred him knew what they were doing, papers or not. Her words gave Jackson a flicker of hope. Not that he had any intention of selling Thunder, but if the horse turned out to be particularly skilled or valuable, it might help justify the resources being spent on his rehabilitation. As if sensing their discussion, Thunder approached the fence where they stood. Sarah offered her hand, which he sniffed cautiously before allowing her to stroke his nose. "There's something unusual about his eyes," she remarked. "They're evaluating, thinking, almost." She glanced at Jackson. "Have you tried any ground training with him yet?" Jackson shook his head. "Just been focusing on getting his strength back." "You might want to start soon. My guess is he's had some training in his past, before whatever happened to him, and a mind like that needs engagement." After Sarah left, her words lingered in Jackson's thoughts. The next morning, he began simple ground exercises with Thunder. Nothing demanding, just basic commands and movements to assess what the horse might already know. To his astonishment, Thunder responded with immediate understanding to verbal and hand signals, executing turns, stops, and backs with precision that suggested extensive previous training. His movements were still measured, his strength limited, but the knowledge was clearly there. "Someone invested a lot of time in you," Jackson murmured, rubbing Thunder's neck appreciatively. "I wonder what else you know." Over the following weeks, as Thunder's physical condition continued to improve, Jackson expanded their training sessions. The horse absorbed new commands with remarkable speed, demonstrating an intelligence that went beyond good training. He seemed to anticipate instructions, problem-solve, and adapt to changing circumstances in ways that left both Jackson and Miguel increasingly impressed. Meanwhile, the ranch's financial situation grew more dire. The bank had set a deadline, 3 months, to make a substantial payment or foreclosure proceedings would begin. Jackson had been selling off equipment, taking odd jobs in town, and cutting expenses to the bone, but it wasn't enough. The specter of losing his family legacy hung over every day. One evening, Jackson sat at his kitchen table with Sarah, who had brought dinner along with her regular check on Thunder. The conversation inevitably turned to the ranch's precarious position. "There's a stock contractor looking for good horses," Sarah mentioned carefully. "Pays well for the right animals." Jackson knew what she was suggesting. Thunder's not ready for that, may never be. "I'm not talking about Thunder," Sarah clarified. "I meant your other horses. The working quarter horses could fetch a good price." The thought of selling his small remuda of working horses, animals that had been born and raised on Hillcrest, felt like admitting defeat. These were horses he'd trained himself, each one representing years of work and connection. "Those horses are essential to whatever cattle operation I can maintain," he said finally. "Without them, I might as well hand over the keys now." Sarah reached across the table to touch his hand. "I know, Jackson. I'm just trying to think of options." Later that night, unable to sleep, Jackson wandered out to the barn. Thunder nickered softly in greeting, now accustomed to Jackson's late-night visits. The horse had filled out remarkably in the past 2 months. His coat had a healthy sheen, his eyes were bright and engaged, and muscle had begun to define his once gaunt frame. "What am I going to do, boy?" Jackson asked quietly, offering an apple from his pocket. "This place has been in my family for generations. I promised Maria I'd keep it going, no matter what." His voice caught slightly at the mention of his late wife. "But I'm running out of roads." Thunder munched the apple thoughtfully, then nudged Jackson's chest with his nose, leaving a sticky spot on his shirt. For some reason, the simple gesture broke through Jackson's carefully maintained composure. He rested his forehead against Thunder's neck, allowing himself a rare moment of vulnerability. "I don't want to let them all down," he whispered. "My parents, Maria, even Miguel and his family who depend on this place." Thunder stood perfectly still, offering silent support in a way that felt almost human in its understanding. As Jackson eventually straightened up and wiped his eyes, he made a decision. Tomorrow he would begin saddle training with Thunder. Not because he expected the horse to solve his financial problems, but because they both needed purpose, a reason to keep pushing forward when logic said to give up. What Jackson couldn't know as he walked back to the house under a canopy of stars was that Thunder was indeed no ordinary horse, and that their journey together was about to take an unexpected turn that would challenge everything people thought. They knew about both man and animal. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the first real hint of winter carried on a brisk wind. Jackson arrived at the barn earlier than usual, a saddle blanket draped over his arm. It was time to see how Thunder responded to the next step in training. Miguel arrived just as Jackson was introducing Thunder to the blanket, letting him sniff and examine it before gently placing it on his back. "You're starting saddle training?" Miguel asked, surprise evident in his voice. "You think he's ready?" Jackson nodded, watching Thunder's reaction carefully. "I think he needs this as much as I do. He's got a mind that needs challenges." To both men's amazement, Thunder accepted the blanket without hesitation. When Jackson returned with a light training saddle, the horse watched with interest but showed no fear. It was as if he recognized the equipment from a distant memory. "This is not his first time," Miguel observed, as Thunder calmly accepted the saddle. "Someone trained this horse well before whatever happened to him." Jackson agreed, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity. Who had Thunder been before? What circumstances had led to his neglect and abandonment? The questions multiplied as they continued the training session, with Thunder responding to each new request with an intelligence that suggested not just training but genuine comprehension. By the end of the week, Thunder was accepting a rider for short periods in the round pen. Jackson started with Miguel, who was lighter, before cautiously mounting himself. The horse carried them both with a natural balance that belied his recent condition. "Jefe," Miguel said after dismounting from a particularly smooth session, "this horse moves like water, so balanced, so responsive, he's special." Jackson had been thinking the same thing. While Thunder was still rebuilding his strength and endurance, his natural ability was becoming more evident each day. He responded to the slightest pressure from legs or reins, sometimes seeming to understand the rider's intentions before they were fully communicated. Word began to spread around the county about Jackson's auction rescue and the remarkable progress the horse was making. Most dismissed it as exaggeration, the kind of feel-good story people tell to make sense of foolish decisions. But a few, including Sarah, saw something worth paying attention to. "You should enter the Thanksgiving charity show at the fairgrounds," she suggested one day after watching Thunder execute a perfect figure 8 in the training ring. Nothing competitive, just the exhibition classes. It would be good experience for both of you. Jackson initially dismissed the idea. He had neither the time nor the money for horse shows, and Thunder wasn't ready for public events. But Sarah persisted, pointing out that the entry fees were minimal and that exposing Thunder to new environments would be valuable for his training. Reluctantly, Jackson agreed to enter one simple class, a basic Western pleasure exhibition, where Thunder would only need to demonstrate walk, trot, and canter in a group setting. It seemed manageable, and if nothing else, it would be a concrete goal to work toward. As the event approached, Jackson devoted more time to preparing Thunder, sometimes working with him late into the evening after finishing his regular ranch chores. The horse seemed to thrive on the attention and the increasingly complex tasks, demonstrating an almost eager approach to learning that contrasted sharply with his earlier resignation. 2 weeks before the show, an unexpected visitor arrived. At Hillcrest, Jackson was working with Thunder in the round pen when a black pickup truck pulled into the yard. A tall man in expensive riding boots and a crisp white shirt emerged, surveying the property with the calculating gaze of someone assessing value rather than appreciating character. "Mr. Reed," the man called out, approaching the fence. "I'm Calvin Brooks. I understand you've got a horse that's been turning heads." Jackson hadn't heard the name before, but something in Brooks' manner put him on guard. "Just working with a rescue," he replied neutrally, continuing Thunder's exercise. "That's him, the auction horse." Brooks studied Thunder with obvious interest. "He's come along better than I would have expected, based on descriptions." "Did you need something, Mr. Brooks?" Jackson asked directly, bringing Thunder to a halt and patting his neck. Brooks smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm always in the market for promising horses. I supply animals for film productions, exhibitions, private collectors. If your rescue has the potential people are talking about, I'd be interested in making you an offer." Jackson felt a protective instinct rise within him. "He's not for sale." "Everything has a price, Mr. Reed," Brooks replied smoothly, "especially in these economic times. I understand Hillcrest Ranch has seen better days." The comment, clearly designed to hit a nerve, succeeded. Jackson bristled, but kept his voice even. "I appreciate your interest, but Thunder isn't on the market. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to finish." Brooks handed him a business card before turning to leave. "Think about it, Mr. Reed. A horse is a luxury in your situation. Money, on the other hand, is a necessity." As the black truck disappeared down the driveway, Jackson looked at the card in his hand, then at Thunder, who had moved to stand close beside him. The horse's intelligent eyes seemed to assess Jackson's mood, his ear flicking forward attentively. "Don't worry, buddy," Jackson said softly. "You're not going anywhere." But as he returned to the house later that evening, the unwelcome visit had planted a seed of disquiet. How had Brooks heard about Thunder, and more importantly, what would happen to the horse, to all his animals, if Jackson couldn't save the ranch? That night, as a cold wind rattled the windows of the old farmhouse, Jackson faced the brutal truth that had been stalking him for months. Without a financial miracle, he would lose Hillcrest. The legacy his family had built, the promise he'd made to Maria as she lay dying, all of it hung by the thinnest of threads. Thunder's unexpected arrival had provided a welcome distraction from these harsh realities. The horse's remarkable recovery and abilities had given Jackson something to focus on, beyond his mounting debts. But Brooks's visit had shattered that temporary escape, bringing Jackson's precarious situation into sharp focus once again. As he lay awake, listening to the wind moan through the eaves, Jackson thought about what Thunder had already taught him. About resilience, about finding strength when everything seemed lost, about the quiet dignity of continuing forward despite past wounds. Whatever happened next, that connection was something no bank could foreclose on, no financial calamity could erase. With that thought providing cold comfort, Jackson finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware that the upcoming charity show would set in motion events that would change everything, for himself, for Thunder, and for everyone who had dismissed them both as lost causes. The day of the Thanksgiving charity show arrived with a chill in the air and thin clouds streaking the morning sky. Jackson loaded Thunder into the trailer with surprising ease. The horse that once shied from confined spaces now stepped confidently into the trailer, as if he understood the purpose of the journey ahead. Miguel had insisted on coming along, rescheduling his family's holiday dinner to support what he called Thunder's debut. As they drove toward the fairgrounds, Jackson found himself unusually nervous. It wasn't just about how Thunder would perform. It was about exposing him to public scrutiny after all they'd been through together. "He'll be fine, Jefe," Miguel said, noticing Jackson's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. "That horse has a better head on his shoulders than most people I know." Jackson managed to smile. "It's not him I'm worried about. It's everyone else." The fairgrounds parking lot was already filled with trucks and trailers when they arrived. Families in holiday attire mingled with competitors in Western show clothing. The charity event had become something of a tradition in the county, a casual show where proceeds went to local food banks and children's programs. As Jackson unloaded Thunder, he could feel curious glances from nearby competitors. The horse had transformed remarkably over the past months. His coat now gleamed in the winter sunlight, his once protruding ribs covered with healthy muscle. Still, he wasn't the polished show horse that others had brought. His tack was well maintained, but clearly well used, and Jackson himself wore his everyday work clothes rather than fancy show attire. "Isn't that Jackson Reed's rescue case?" he overheard someone say as he led Thunder toward the warm-up area. "The auction horse? Heard he paid next to nothing for it. Looks better than I expected, but this isn't exactly a rescue parade." Jackson kept his focus on Thunder, who seemed remarkably calm despite the bustling environment. The horse's ears swiveled to take in the sounds, but his steps remained steady, his trust in Jackson evident in every movement. Sarah met them at the entrance to the warm-up ring, her face lighting up when she saw Thunder. "He looks incredible, Jackson," she said, running a hand along Thunder's gleaming neck. "You'd never know what he's been through." "We've still got a long way to go," Jackson replied, though he couldn't help the pride that crept into his voice. "Well, you've drawn 7th in the order," Sarah informed him. "Perfect spot. Not too early, not too late. Just enough time to let him get used to the environment." Jackson nodded, feeling a flutter of anticipation as he led Thunder into the warm-up area. Other riders were already circling, their horses responding to subtle cues with practiced precision. Most rode expensive, well-bred animals with pedigrees that commanded respect in the show world. For a moment, doubt crept in. What was he doing here with an auction rescue? This wasn't a feel-good charity case. These were serious riders who competed regularly. Thunder might have made remarkable progress, but this was a different world entirely. As if sensing his handler's uncertainty, Thunder nudged Jackson's shoulder gently. The touch was enough to center him, to remind him why they were here. This wasn't about winning ribbons. It was about showing Thunder that there was more to life than survival, that after the darkness came opportunity, connection, and joy. Jackson mounted with practiced ease, settling into the saddle as Thunder adjusted beneath him. They began with simple walking exercises, allowing the horse to acclimate to the busy environment. Thunder moved with the same fluid grace he showed. At home, his attention split between his surroundings and Jackson's cues. As they transitioned to a trot, Jackson could feel the quality of Thunder's movement, the balanced, rhythmic steps that came naturally to the horse despite his troubled past. A few nearby riders took notice, their casual glances becoming more focused as Thunder executed perfect transitions between gaits. By the time they moved to a canter, several people had paused their own warm-ups to watch. Thunder's movement had a flowing quality that made it look effortless, his natural balance allowing Jackson to use minimal guidance. "Who is that?" A woman in an elaborate show outfit asked her companion, not bothering to lower her voice. "Some rancher from out by Millerville," came the reply. "That's the horse everyone's been talking about, the one he got for practically nothing at the county auction." "No way," the woman said, skepticism clear in her tone. "A horse moving like that? You don't find that at a county auction." Jackson pretended not to hear, focusing instead on Thunder's final warm-up sequences. As they completed their preparation, he guided Thunder to a quiet corner of the arena, allowing him to rest before their class. The announcer's voice crackled over the speakers, calling the first competitors for the Western Pleasure exhibition. Jackson watched as polished riders on equally polished horses entered the main arena, executing the required patterns with practiced precision. When his number was called, Jackson took a deep breath, gave Thunder a reassuring pat, and guided him toward the entrance. As they passed through the gateway, the noise and energy of the crowded arena washed over them. For a moment, Thunder hesitated, his ears flicking rapidly as he processed the new environment. "Easy, boy," Jackson murmured, "just like at home." Thunder's stride faltered for only a second before he seemed to gather himself, squaring his shoulders and moving forward with renewed confidence. As they joined the line of horses circling the arena, Jackson could feel the shift in Thunder's demeanor. A quiet pride, an almost palpable desire to show what he could do. The judge called for a walk, and the line of horses moved in unison around the arena's perimeter. Thunder matched their pace precisely, his head carried at the perfect angle, his steps measured and graceful. When the call came to trot, the transition was flawless. Not a moment of hesitation or confusion. It was during the canter that Thunder truly began to shine. While other horses performed admirably, there was something distinctive about Thunder's movement, a natural harmony that couldn't be trained, only refined. His canter had an almost musical quality, a three-beat rhythm so perfect it seemed choreographed. Jackson could hear the murmurs from the sidelines, could feel the looks from other competitors, but he kept his focus entirely on Thunder. This moment wasn't about them or the ribbons or proving anything to anyone. It was about honoring the journey they had taken together, about celebrating how far they had come from that dusty auction pen. When the judge called for horses to line up in the center, Jackson guided Thunder into position with the other competitors. The horse stood perfectly still, his ears forward, his presence commanding despite his humble origins. Next to the expensive show horses with their fancy, tack and meticulously groomed appearances, Thunder might have seemed out of place. Yet there was a quiet dignity in his stance that drew the eye. The judge approached each horse in turn, examining conformation and movement up close. When he reached Thunder, Jackson noticed the man's eyebrows raise slightly. The judge spent longer with Thunder than with any other horse, circling him completely before making notes on his clipboard. As the placings were announced, Jackson kept his expectations measured. They had accomplished their goal simply by participating, by showing Thunder that he belonged in this arena as much as any purpose-bred show horse. "Fifth place, number 18, the announcer called. The ribbons continued to be distributed, with fourth and third places going to experienced competitors on well-known horses. Second place, number 7, Jackson Reed on Thunder. For a moment, Jackson wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Second place against this field of experienced show horses? He accepted the red ribbon in a daze, aware of the mixture of surprise and assessment in the gazes that followed him. As they exited the arena, Sarah was waiting, her face alight with excitement. "Did you see the judge's face?" she asked, practically bouncing. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Jackson dismounted, running a hand along Thunder's neck with quiet pride. He was perfect. "Better than perfect," Sarah insisted. "Jackson, do you have any idea what just happened in there? Thunder just placed second in his first show ever, against horses that have been competing their whole lives." Before Jackson could respond, they were approached by a middle-aged man in a well-tailored western shirt. His silver belt buckle and custom boots marked him as someone established in the horse world. "Reed, isn't it?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Martin Whitaker. That's quite a horse you've got there." Jackson shook the man's hand, recognizing the name. Martin Whitaker owned one of the most successful quarter-horse breeding operations in the state. "Thank you," Jackson replied simply. "He's come a long way." "So I've heard." Whitaker studied Thunder with an expert's eye. "The story going around is that you picked him up as a rescue at the county auction a few months back, is that right?" Jackson nodded, unsure where this was heading. "Remarkable transformation," Whitaker commented, "but what's more remarkable is his natural ability. A horse doesn't move like that without something special in his bloodline." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "I'd be interested in having my veterinarian take a look at him, maybe run some tests. With your permission, of course." "Tests?" Jackson asked, puzzled. "DNA testing, specifically," Whitaker clarified. "I have a hunch about this horse, and if I'm right, it could be significant." He handed Jackson a business card. "Think about it. No obligation, but I'd cover all costs. I'm simply curious." As Whitaker walked away, Sarah stared after him with wide eyes. "Do you know who that was?" she asked in a hushed tone. "Martin Whitaker runs Whispering Pines Ranch. Jackson, his horses sell for tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands. If he's interested in Thunder's bloodline—" She trailed off, the implications hanging in the air between them. Jackson didn't allow himself to follow that train of thought. Getting his hopes up about Thunder's mysterious past wouldn't help their present situation. Instead, he focused on caring for Thunder after his performance, making sure the horse was comfortable and properly cooled down before loading him back into the trailer. As they prepared to leave, Jackson noticed several people pointing in their direction, conversations pausing as they passed. Thunder's performance had clearly made an impression. Whether it would amount to anything beyond today remained to be seen. The drive back to Hillcrest was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Miguel occasionally glanced at the red ribbon hanging from the rearview mirror, a small smile playing on his lips. Jackson's mind kept returning to Whitaker's words. the possibility that Thunder might have a significant bloodline, one worth investigating. When they arrived home, Jackson was surprised to find another vehicle parked in the driveway. Calvin, Brooks's black pickup truck. The man himself was leaning against the porch railing, his posture casual, but his presence unmistakably an intrusion. "Mr. Reed," Brooks called as Jackson stepped out of his truck. "Congratulations on your showing today. News travels fast." Jackson kept his expression neutral as he began unloading Thunder. "Mr. Brooks, I don't recall inviting you to my property." Brooks pushed away from the railing, approaching with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting his way. "I happened to be at the charity show. Quite an impressive performance from a horse everyone had written off." Thunder watched Brooks warily as Jackson led him from the trailer, the horse's ears flicking back and forth with obvious distrust. It was a reaction Jackson hadn't seen since the early days of their relationship, and it made him immediately more suspicious of their visitor. "I'll cut to the chase," Brooks continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "My offer has doubled. $100,000 for the horse right now. Cash deal, no complications." The amount was staggering, enough to pay off the bank for months, maybe even a year. It was more money than Jackson had seen in one place in his entire life. For a moment, he could almost see the weight lifting from his shoulders, the constant pressure of impending foreclosure momentarily suspended. But then Thunder shifted beside him, pressing closer as if seeking reassurance. Jackson looked into those intelligent eyes and knew with absolute certainty that some things truly were beyond price. "Mr. Brooks," he said evenly, "I told you before, Thunder isn't for sale, not for any amount." Brooks's mask of friendliness slipped, revealing a flash of irritation. "Everyone has a price, Reed, especially a struggling rancher one step away from foreclosure." The casual mention of his financial troubles confirmed what Jackson had suspected. Brooks had been investigating him, calculating exactly how desperate he might be. "You've wasted a trip," Jackson replied, leading Thunder toward the barn, "and I'd appreciate it if you didn't come back." As Brooks drove away, tires kicking up gravel in a clear display of frustration, Miguel approached from where he had been watching the exchange. 100,000? He asked quietly. "That would solve many problems, Jefe." Jackson nodded, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. "It would, but I'd be trading one problem for another." He stroked Thunder's neck. "This horse trusted me when he had no reason to trust anyone. I won't betray that for any amount of money." Later that evening, after Thunder was settled in his stall with extra hay as a reward for his performance, Jackson sat on his porch with the business card Martin Whitaker had given him. The offer of DNA testing seemed innocuous enough, mere curiosity from a breeder who recognized quality. Unlike Brooks's predatory interest, Whitaker had seemed genuinely intrigued by Thunder as a horse, not just as a commodity. Jackson pulled out his phone and dialed the number on the card, making a decision that would set in motion events he couldn't possibly anticipate. The blood tests were conducted the following week, a simple procedure that Thunder tolerated with his usual stoic patience. Whitaker's veterinarian, an efficient woman named Dr. Lawson, drew the samples quickly and spent some time examining Thunder with professional interest. "Remarkable recovery," she commented as she packed up her equipment. "Based on what I've heard about his condition a few months ago, I wouldn't have expected such complete rehabilitation." "He's a fighter," Jackson replied simply. Dr. Lawson nodded. "The results will take about 2 weeks. Mr. Whitaker has arranged for expedited processing." Those 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Jackson continued working with Thunder daily, building on the confidence gained from the charity show. The horse seemed to thrive on the increasingly complex exercises, demonstrating an aptitude for precision movements that Jackson had never seen in any of his working ranch horses. Meanwhile, the ranch's financial situation continued its downward trajectory. The bank sent another notice, this one more explicitly threatening than the last. Without a substantial payment by the new year, foreclosure proceedings would begin in earnest. Jackson took on extra work breaking horses for neighboring ranches, spending dawn to dusk in the saddle and coming home exhausted. Miguel worked double shifts as well, both men pushing themselves to the limit to keep Hillcrest afloat for just a little longer. Through it all, Thunder became Jackson's constant companion, a source of quiet strength when everything else seemed to be crumbling. In the pre-dawn hours, Jackson would often find himself in the barn, talking to Thunder in the darkness about his fears, his hopes, and the promises he was increasingly afraid he couldn't keep. "My grandfather built this place with his bare hands," he told Thunder one morning as he prepared for another grueling day. "Survived the Dust Bowl, kept it going through the Depression. My father expanded it, made it profitable enough to support all of us." He sighed, leaning against the stall door. "And now I'm the one who might lose it all." Thunder listened, as he always did, his intelligent eyes following Jackson's movements, his ears flicking forward to catch every word. Sometimes Jackson wondered if the horse truly understood him, or if he was simply projecting his own needs onto an animal that had become more than just a rescue project. 12 days after the blood test, Martin Whitaker called, his voice crackling with barely contained excitement. "Reed, I need to see you and that horse as soon as possible," he said without preamble. "The results are in, and you're going to want to hear this in person." They arranged to meet the following day at Whitaker's ranch, a sprawling property about an hour's drive from Hillcrest. Jackson spent the evening wondering what the tests might have revealed, and whether it would make any difference to the rapidly approaching deadline hanging over his head. Whispering Pines Ranch was everything Hillcrest wasn't. Meticulously maintained, clearly prosperous, with state-of-the-art facilities and immaculately groomed grounds. As Jackson drove through the ornate entrance gates, he felt a pang of both, admiration and discomfort. This was a different world from his struggling operation. He unloaded Thunder carefully, noticing how the horse took in the new surroundings with alert interest rather than fear. They were met by a young woman who introduced herself as Whitaker's assistant and led them to a large office attached to the main barn. Martin Whitaker was waiting for them, along with Dr. Lawson and another man Jackson didn't recognize. Whitaker's face broke into a smile when Thunder was led into the room. "There he is," he said, with something like reverence. "The horse nobody wanted." "Mr. Reed," Dr. Lawson greeted him. "Thank you for coming. We have some rather extraordinary findings to share with you." They settled into comfortable chairs, Thunder standing patiently beside Jackson as Whitaker pulled out a file folder. "First, let me introduce Richard Thornton," Whitaker said, gesturing to the third man. "Richard is with the American Quarter Horse Association's registry office." Jackson nodded in greeting, his curiosity mounting. Why would someone from the AQHA be interested in an unregistered auction horse? "Mr. Reed," Whitaker began, "what I'm about to tell you is going to sound incredible, but we've verified the facts through multiple channels. He opened the folder, removing several documents and photographs. Thunder's DNA test revealed something quite unexpected. He has a direct genetic link to impressive revolution. The name hung in the air for a moment before Jackson responded, "I'm afraid that doesn't mean much to me." Thornton leaned forward. Impressive Revolution was one of the most influential sires in quarter horse breeding history. His descendants have won more championships than almost any other bloodline. A direct descendant, especially one as talented as your horse appears to be, is extraordinarily valuable. Jackson's mind struggled to make sense of this information. But that's impossible. Thunder came from a local farm foreclosure. He had no papers, no history. Whitaker nodded. That's where the story gets interesting. We did some digging after the DNA results came back. 6 years ago, a valuable breeding stallion disappeared from a ranch in Oklahoma, presumed stolen. That horse was Midnight Revolution, a direct son of Impressive Revolution, worth close to $500,000. Dr. Lawson picked up the narrative. The markings match, the age matches, and now we have DNA confirmation. Your Thunder is Midnight Revolution. Jackson stared at Thunder in disbelief. The neglected auction horse he'd purchased for $200 was actually a stolen champion worth more than his entire ranch. There's more, Whitaker continued, because he was stolen, not sold. His registration was never properly transferred. Legally speaking, Thunder, or Midnight rather, still belongs to his original owner, or would if that owner was still alive. What do you mean? Jackson asked, a sense of dread building. The original owner died 2 years ago, Thornton explained. His ranch was sold to settle debts. There are no clear claims on the horse now, especially after so much time has passed. Which means, Whitaker concluded, once we update his registration and confirm his identity, he's legally yours, Mr. Reed. A horse worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. The revelation hung in the air like a mirage, too fantastic to be fully believed. Jackson looked at Thunder, Midnight Revolution, with new eyes, seeing both the champion he apparently was and the resilient survivor he had come to know. There's one more thing you should know, Whitaker added, his tone shifting slightly. A horse with this bloodline, these natural abilities and proper training could be worth far more than his purchase value. As a breeding stallion, he could command stud fees in the tens of thousands. The right buyer might pay 7 figures for him, and there it was, the solution to all of Jackson's problems, wrapped in an impossible coincidence. The horse he had rescued on impulse, the animal he had nursed back from the brink, was actually a living treasure. Selling him would save Hillcrest Ranch, secure Miguel's future, and fulfill the promises Jackson had made to Maria and his family legacy. Yet, as the conversation continued around him, with Thornton discussing registration details and Whitaker outlining potential next steps, Jackson found himself oddly silent. He watched Thunder. It was hard to think of him as Midnight, standing patiently beside him, those intelligent eyes taking in the room with the same quiet dignity he had shown in that forgotten auction pen. This horse had taught him about resilience when his own had faltered. He had provided purpose when Jackson was drowning in despair. He had become more than a project or even a companion. He had become a symbol of everything Jackson believed, about second chances and seeing value where others saw only brokenness. As he drove home that afternoon, the folder of documentation on the seat beside him, Jackson faced the most difficult decision of his life. The deadline from the bank loomed. Just 3 weeks away. Thunder's newly discovered identity offered an immediate solution, a way to save everything he had worked for, everything his family had built. Yet the thought of selling him, of watching that trailer drive away with Thunder inside, created a hollow ache in Jackson's chest that no amount of money could fill. Some partnerships transcended practical considerations. Some bonds couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Back at Hillcrest, Jackson led Thunder to his stall, removing the halter with practiced hands. The horse watched him with the same trusting gaze he'd gradually developed over their months together, unaware that his fate and Jackson's now hung in the balance. "You're not who I thought you were," Jackson murmured, stroking the horse's forehead. "But then again, maybe you're exactly who I always knew you were." Thunder nickered softly in response, pushing his nose against Jackson's chest in the gesture. That had become his way of offering comfort. In that moment, despite the whirlwind of revelations and the weight of decisions to come, one thing became absolutely clear to Jackson Reed. Whatever Thunder's true identity might be, auction rescue or stolen champion, the connection they had forged was real. And some things, once found, were too precious to surrender, no matter what the cost. Thunder's true identity as Midnight Revolution spread through the equestrian community like wildfire. Within days of Martin Whitaker's revelation, Jackson found himself fielding calls from reporters, breeders, and potential buyers. His quiet ranch, once forgotten on the outskirts of Willow Creek County, suddenly became a destination for the curious and the ambitious. Jackson maintained a protective barrier around Thunder, limiting visitors and turning down interview requests. The horse had already endured enough upheaval in his life. He didn't need to become a spectacle now. But the pressure continued to mount as the story gained traction. The stolen champion, presumed lost forever, discovered in a rural auction. Penned and rescued by a struggling rancher who had no idea of his true value. "It's like something from a movie," Sarah remarked one evening as she helped Jackson sort through the mounting stack of business cards and offers. "Everyone loves a good redemption story." Jackson didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on Thunder grazing peacefully in the evening light. The horse looked up as if sensing Jackson's attention and nickered softly before returning to his meal. "For them, it's a story," Jackson finally said. "For him, it's his life." Martin Whitaker had been generous with his expertise, helping Jackson navigate the complexities of updating Thunder's registration and establishing legal ownership. The process was complicated by the horse's history. Stolen from his original owner, passed through unknown hands before ending up neglected at the Bowman place, then auctioned as an anonymous rescue case. But Whitaker was confident that given the circumstances and the years that had passed, Jackson's claim would stand. "The registry board meets next week," Whitaker informed him over the phone. "They'll review the DNA evidence and your purchase. Documentation, I don't foresee any complications." "And after that?" Jackson asked, the question that had been haunting him for days. "After that," Whitaker replied, understanding the unspoken concern, "you'll have a fully registered, extremely valuable stallion with a documented lineage. What you do with him will be entirely your decision." That decision weighed on Jackson like a physical burden. Each day brought the bank's deadline closer, each night filled with calculations and considerations that left him exhausted by morning. The practical choice was clear. Sell Thunder to the highest bidder, save the ranch, secure the future that generations of Reeds had built. Yet every time he reached that logical conclusion, He found himself in the barn at dawn, watching Thunder's ears prick forward at his approach, feeling the gentle nudge against his shoulder that had become the horse's signature greeting. How could he put a price on that connection? How could he justify selling a being who had given him hope when everything else seemed lost? 2 weeks after the DNA revelation, Jackson received a visit from Richard Thornton, the AQHA registry representative. The man arrived with a folder of official documentation and a subdued excitement that spoke of his respect for the situation. "Everything's in order," Thornton announced as they stood in the barn aisle, Thunder watching them curiously from his stall. "The registration board has recognized Midnight Revolution's identity and your legal ownership. He's officially yours. Mr. Reed, with all the rights and privileges that entails." He handed Jackson a fresh registration certificate, the name Midnight Revolution printed in bold letters, with Thunder noted as his barn name. Below the formal documentation were notes about his championship bloodline, his estimated value, and the contact information for several breeding programs that had already expressed interest. "This is one of the most remarkable cases I've encountered in 20 years with the registry," Thornton admitted. "A horse of this caliber, lost for so long, then found in such circumstances, it's unprecedented." Jackson glanced at the estimated value printed at the bottom of the page, a figure that made his throat tighten. It was enough to save Hillcrest. 3 times over, enough to modernize the entire operation and still have a comfortable cushion for years to come. "What would you do?" he asked suddenly, surprising himself with the question, "if you were in my position?" Thornton considered this carefully, his gaze shifting to Thunder, who had stretched his neck over the stall door, ears forward with interest. "From a purely business perspective, the answer is simple," he said. "His value as a breeding stallion is extraordinary. The right buyer would pay a premium price, and his offspring would command top dollar." He paused, his expression softening. "But I've been around horses my whole life, Mr. Reed. I've seen thousands of them, and only a handful with eyes like his. That kind of intelligence, that kind of connection with a human, that's something special." He didn't offer a direct answer, and Jackson didn't press for one. Some decisions couldn't be outsourced, no matter how much easier that might make things. Later that day, Jackson sat on his porch with his grandfather's old ledger, trying to make the numbers work. The bank's deadline was just 10 days away. Without a substantial payment, Hillcrest would begin the irreversible slide toward foreclosure. He'd explored every alternative: refinancing, partial land sales, even taking on an investor who might be willing to share ownership of the ranch in exchange for capital. None of the options were viable in the time remaining. The drought had depressed land values throughout the region, and potential investors saw Hillcrest as a failing operation with limited prospects for recovery. The only immediate solution was Thunder, a living, breathing miracle who had appeared in Jackson's life at precisely the moment of greatest need. It seemed almost providential, a test of values wrapped in the guise of salvation. As twilight descended over the ranch, Jackson set aside the ledger and walked to the paddock where Thunder was enjoying his evening turnout. The horse approached the fence at his arrival, no longer the hesitant, broken creature from the auction pen, but a confident, dignified animal who carried himself with the natural grace of his championship bloodline. "What am I supposed to do?" "Oh boy," Jackson asked softly, stroking Thunder's forelock. "How do I choose between you and everything my family has built?" Thunder's response was to press his muzzle against Jackson's chest. the gesture that had become his way of offering comfort. Jackson wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, allowing himself a moment of vulnerability that he would have hidden from any human observer. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to make this choice," he admitted in a whisper. "Either way, I lose something irreplaceable." The following morning, Jackson received a call that momentarily pushed aside his internal struggle. Sarah's voice came through with uncharacteristic urgency. "Jackson, you need to get into town right now. There's something you have to see." The local diner had become an impromptu gathering place, its small television tuned to a regional news channel. When Jackson arrived, several familiar faces glanced up with expressions ranging from concern to outright anger. "There he is," someone muttered, gesturing toward the screen. Calvin Brooks stood before a backdrop of microphones, his expression serious as he addressed reporters. "As a responsible member of the equestrian community," Brooks was saying, "I have significant concerns about the welfare of this valuable animal. Midnight Revolution is a horse with championship bloodlines, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. His proper place is in a professional facility with appropriate security and expertise, not on a failing ranch with the owner facing imminent foreclosure." The camera panned to show photographs of Thunder, clearly taken during Brooks' uninvited visits to Hillcrest, alongside images of the ranch's weathered buildings and drought-stricken pastures. "I've made multiple generous offers to purchase the horse," Brooks continued, "all of which have been rejected. This raises serious questions about Mr. Reed's judgment and his ability to properly care for an animal of this significance." The report cut to a news anchor who explained that Brooks had filed a formal complaint with the state's Animal Welfare Board, claiming that Jackson's financial situation rendered him incapable of providing adequate care for a horse of Thunder's value and significance. "They can't do this," Sarah said fiercely as the segment concluded. "It's a baseless accusation. Thunder is in perfect health, better than he's been in years thanks to you." Jackson nodded, but the cold weight in his stomach told him this was more serious than Sarah wanted to admit. Brooks had found a leverage point, using Jackson's financial struggles against him, framing his refusal to sell as irresponsible rather than principled. "He knows exactly what he's doing," Jackson said quietly. "If he can't buy Thunder, he'll try to force my hand through legal channels." The accusation spread quickly through the community, with opinions divided along predictable lines. Those who knew Jackson personally defended his care of Thunder and his right to make his own decisions about the horse. Others, particularly those from the more elite equestrian circles, sided with Brooks' argument that a horse of such value and genetic importance belonged in professional hands. 3 days later, a representative from the state Animal Welfare Board arrived at Hillcrest for an inspection. The woman, whose name was Ms. Harrington, conducted a thorough examination of Thunder and his living conditions, taking extensive notes and photographs. "I want to be clear, Mr. Reed," she said as she completed her assessment, "that this inspection was triggered by a specific complaint. It's not a reflection on your general reputation as a horseman." Jackson appreciated the small kindness in her words, but it did little to alleviate his concern. "And your findings?" Miss Harrington glanced again at Thunder, who was demonstrating his perfect health through the simple act of being himself, alert, engaged, and visibly content in Jackson's presence. "The horse appears to be in excellent condition," she acknowledged. Your facilities, while not luxurious, are clean, safe, and well maintained. I see no evidence of neglect or inadequate care." She paused, her expression becoming more formal. "However, the complaint also raises concerns about your financial ability to continue providing appropriate care, given the reported status of your ranch." There it was, the trap Brooks had set. Even with Thunder in peak condition, the specter of Jackson's impending financial collapse provided grounds for concern. "The board will review my report," Ms. Harrington concluded. "You'll be notified of their decision within the week." After she left, Jackson called Martin Whitaker, explaining the situation in terse sentences that barely contained his frustration. "Brooks is playing dirty," Whitaker agreed when Jackson finished. "But he's smart. He's using your financial vulnerability against you, knowing it's the one area where you can't easily defend yourself." "What are my options?" Jackson asked, pacing the length of his porch. "Legally, you own Thunder outright. The board can't force you to sell him unless they determine he's being neglected or abused, which is clearly not the case." Whitaker paused. "But they could make recommendations that would be difficult to ignore, especially if they believe your financial situation poses an imminent risk to his welfare." Meaning? Meaning Brooks has found a pressure point. Even if the board doesn't order you to sell, their investigation creates a cloud of doubt that could affect future decisions about Thunder, breeding opportunities, competition eligibility, and so on. Jackson hung up feeling more trapped than ever. Brooks had transformed what should have been a personal decision into a public controversy, one that questioned not just Jackson's financial stability, but his character as a horseman. That night, unable to sleep, Jackson sat on the porch steps, watching the moonlight cast long shadows across the ranch yard. The bank's deadline was now just 7 days away, overlapping with the welfare board's pending decision. The walls were closing in from all sides, leaving fewer options with each passing hour. A soft nicker drew his attention to the paddock gate, where Thunder stood watching him. Jackson hadn't realized the horse was still out, but now he approached the fence, feeling a familiar warmth as Thunder stretched his neck to greet him. "You should be sleeping," Jackson said softly, running his hand along the horse's sleek neck. Thunder responded by pressing his muzzle against Jackson's shoulder, the gesture that had become their shared language of comfort and connection. In that moment, something shifted in Jackson's perspective, a clarity emerging from the chaos of recent weeks. Thunder had come into his life when all seemed lost, offering purpose when despair threatened to overwhelm him. Their journey together had been about more than rehabilitation or training. It had been about rediscovering faith when logic said to surrender, about seeing potential where others saw only brokenness. Now, facing the possible loss of everything he had worked for, Jackson realized that the answer had been in front of him all along. Some things were meant to be temporary, others were meant to endure. The question wasn't whether to choose between Thunder and the ranch. It was about recognizing what truly mattered in the long arc of a life. With that realization came a plan, not perfect, not without risk, but aligned with the core values that had guided his family for generations. Tomorrow he would set it in motion. The morning brought a clear sky and a determination that Jackson hadn't felt in months. He called Miguel first, asking him to meet at the ranch office to discuss something important. Then Sarah, whose veterinary expertise would be crucial to what he had in mind. Finally, Martin Whitaker, whose surprised silence spoke volumes when Jackson outlined his intentions. By noon, The four of them sat around Jackson's kitchen table, the plan laid out in simple, direct terms that left no room for misinterpretation. "You understand what you're proposing?" Whitaker said, not a question, but a statement seeking confirmation. Jackson nodded. "I do. It's not the conventional choice, but it's the right one. For Thunder, for Hillcrest, and for me." Sarah leaned forward, her expression a mix of concern and admiration. "It's a huge risk, Jackson. If it doesn't work, then I'll have tried," he replied simply. "That's more than I could say if I took the easy way out." Miguel, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke. "My father used to say that a man is measured not by what he owns, but by what he refuses to surrender. I think he would approve of this plan, Jefe." With their cautious support, Jackson refined the details, addressing potential pitfalls and creating contingency plans. By evening, they had a framework that, while unorthodox, offered a path forward that honored both his commitment to Thunder and his family's legacy. The following day, Jackson drove to the bank, the folder of documentation on the seat beside him. The meeting with the loan officer was brief but productive, ending with a handshake that felt like a stay of execution, however temporary. Next came a call to the Animal Welfare Board, where Jackson presented his case with a directness that seemed to catch Ms. Harrington off guard. He didn't deny his financial challenges, but outlined the steps he was taking to address them. Steps that prioritize Thunder's welfare while respecting his own principles. Finally, he contacted a local reporter who had been seeking an interview since the story broke. Unlike the sensationalized coverage Brooks had orchestrated, Jackson wanted to present the full narrative, not just Thunder's remarkable identity, but the deeper story of connection and mutual rescue that had unfolded at Hillcrest. 3 days later, as the bank's deadline loomed and the Welfare Board's decision remained pending, Jackson implemented the core of his plan. In the pre-dawn light, he led Thunder to the newly prepared area behind the main barn. Not the small paddock where the horse had first regained his strength, but a spacious, carefully designed facility that represented Jackson's vision for the future. Miguel joined him, bringing the specialized equipment they had been setting up over the previous days. Sarah arrived soon after, her truck loaded with supplies and monitoring devices. By the time the sun crested the horizon, they were ready for the first test of their unorthodox approach. As if sensing the significance of the moment, Thunder stood quietly as Jackson fitted him with the custom equipment. There was no resistance, no hesitation, just the same trust that had gradually built between them over months of patient work. "All right, boy," Jackson said softly, stroking Thunder's neck. "Let's show them what we can do together." What followed was a demonstration of harmony between horse and handler that transcended conventional training. With minimal guidance, Thunder moved through a series of increasingly complex patterns, his movements fluid and precise, his intelligence evident in every response to Jackson's subtle cues. Sarah monitored the physiological readings, nodding with satisfaction as the numbers confirmed what was visibly apparent. Thunder wasn't just performing. He was engaged, focused, and genuinely enjoying the work. "It's remarkable," she said, as they completed the session. "His heart rate, his respiratory patterns, they're optimal throughout. He's not stressed. He's stimulated in exactly the right ways." Miguel, who had been recording the entire session, reviewed the footage with growing excitement. "This is better than we hoped, Jefe. Much better." Jackson nodded, allowing himself a moment of cautious optimism. The first phase had gone well, but the true test was still to come. 3 days later, a small crowd gathered at Hillcrest Ranch. The group included Martin Whitaker, Richard Thornton from the AQHA Registry, Ms. Harrington from the Welfare Board, the reporter Jackson had contacted, and, arriving separately and standing at a distance, Calvin Brooks, whose unexpected appearance suggested he'd heard rumors of what was happening. Jackson had prepared a simple presentation area near the new facility, with chairs arranged to provide a clear view of the demonstration space. As the visitors settled in, he stepped forward to address them directly. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady despite the stakes of this moment. "I've invited you here today to witness something that I believe will change how we think about thunder, or Midnight Revolution, as some of you know him." He explained briefly the circumstances of finding Thunder at auction, nursing him back to health, and the subsequent discovery of his true identity. But rather than dwelling on the past, Jackson focused on the future, specifically the innovative program he had developed with Sarah's expertise. "Thunder isn't just a valuable breeding stallion," Jackson continued. "He possesses an extraordinary intelligence and sensitivity that goes beyond what we typically expect from horses, even exceptional ones. What we're going to demonstrate today is the beginning of something new, a partnership that honors his unique abilities and creates value in ways that transcend traditional metrics." With that introduction, Jackson signaled to Miguel, who opened the gate to the demonstration area. Thunder entered with quiet confidence, wearing the specialized equipment they had developed, a combination of sensors and lightweight devices that monitored and responded to his movements and physiological signals. What followed left even the most experienced horse people in the audience speechless. Without visible commands from Jackson, Thunder began executing a complex series of movements and tasks, some resembling dressage patterns, others demonstrating problem-solving abilities rarely seen in equines. The sensors picked up subtle changes in his muscle tension, heart rate, and orientation, translating them into data that appeared on screens visible to the audience. "What you're seeing," Jackson explained as Thunder continued his demonstration, "is a horse whose intelligence and sensitivity allow him to participate in a form of communication we're just beginning to understand. The equipment he's wearing doesn't control him. It listens to him, turning his natural abilities into quantifiable information." Sarah took over, detailing the potential applications of their work, from advanced equine therapy programs to specialized training for service animals, even research into animal cognition that could benefit multiple species. "The traditional model would be to sell Thunder to the highest bidder," Jackson concluded, as the demonstration ended and Thunder returned to stand quietly beside him. "But his greatest value isn't as a possession. It's as a partner in something new, something that honors what makes him truly exceptional." He outlined the program they had developed. Thunder would remain at Hillcrest, which would transition from a struggling cattle ranch to a specialized equine research and therapy center. The initial funding would come from limited breeding rights, carefully structured to preserve Thunder's well-being while capitalizing on his genetic value. But the long-term vision went far beyond breeding. "We've already secured preliminary commitments from 3 universities and 2 therapeutic riding programs," Jackson revealed, nodding toward Martin Whitaker, who had helped broker these connections. "They recognize that what Thunder represents is more valuable than his price tag. It's a new understanding of what's possible when we truly partner with these animals instead of simply owning them. As the presentation concluded, the audience response was mixed, but largely positive. The welfare board representative seemed particularly impressed, making notes that suggested their decision would favor Jackson's plan. Even Brooks, though clearly disappointed that his attempt to force a sale had failed, appeared grudgingly intrigued by the commercial potential of the research program. The local reporter stayed longest, conducting in-depth interviews with Jackson, Sarah, and Miguel about their vision for Thunder's future and the transformation of Hillcrest Ranch. When asked if he regretted not taking the millions offered for Thunder, Jackson's answer was simple and direct. "Some things can't be measured in dollars," he said, watching as Thunder grazed peacefully nearby. "The easy choice isn't always the right one. Sometimes you have to trust that commitment to your values will create a path forward, even when you can't see exactly where it leads." 6 months later, Hillcrest Ranch hosted its first official event as the Hillcrest Equine Research and Therapy Center. The drought had finally broken, painting the once parched landscape in vibrant greens. New facilities had been constructed alongside the original ranch buildings, creating a blend of traditional architecture and modern functionality. Thunder, now officially recognized throughout the equestrian world as the rediscovered champion. Midnight Revolution had his own spacious paddock adjacent to the main research facility. His first limited breeding season had been successful beyond expectations, with the foals already commanding premium prices based on both his bloodline and the remarkable abilities he continued to demonstrate. More significant than the breeding program, however, was the pioneering work being done with Thunder as the centerpiece. The communication system Jackson and Sarah had developed was evolving rapidly, yielding insights into equine cognition that attracted attention from researchers worldwide. The therapeutic applications were showing particular promise, with Thunder demonstrating an almost uncanny ability to connect with children and adults facing various challenges. As Jackson watched a therapy session from the observation area, he reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The struggling rancher who had impulsively purchased a neglected horse at auction could never have imagined this outcome, not just financial stability, but a renewed sense of purpose that honored both his family's legacy and his own values. The bank loans had been restructured, the foreclosure threat eliminated. Miguel now managed an expanded staff, his own position secure, and his children offered educational opportunities through the university partnerships. Sarah divided her time between her veterinary practice and research at the center, her expertise finally receiving the recognition it deserved. And Thunder, the horse no one wanted, the champion hidden beneath neglect and misfortune, had found his true calling. No longer defined by his monetary value or his genetic potential, he had become a pioneer in his own right, opening new pathways of understanding between humans and horses. Later that evening, as the day's activities wound down, Jackson found himself alone with Thunder in the quiet paddock. The horse approached with the same gentle recognition he had shown from the earliest days of their relationship, pressing his muzzle against Jackson's chest in their familiar gesture of connection. "We did it, boy," Jackson said softly, stroking the sleek neck that once had been gaunt with neglect. "We found another way." Thunder nickered softly in response, his intelligent eyes seeming to reflect understanding of the journey they had traveled together. From auction pen to research center, from desperation to innovation, from what everyone else saw as worthless to something beyond price. In that moment, standing in the glow of sunset with the ranch buildings silhouetted against the horizon, Jackson Reed knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. Some partnerships transcended conventional wisdom. Some connections defied calculation. And sometimes, the most valuable discovery wasn't what a horse was worth, but what he could teach about courage, faith, and the transformative power of seeing potential where others saw only limitations. Thunder had come into his life when all seemed lost, a supposed burden that proved to be salvation, but not in the way anyone would have predicted. Their shared journey had created something new, not just a rescued horse and a saved ranch, but a vision for what might be possible when we recognize the extraordinary hiding in plain sight, waiting only for someone willing to look deeper, to trust their instincts, and to believe in second chances. As darkness fell over Hillcrest, horse and man stood together in companionable silence, two lives intertwined by circumstance and choice, their shared story still unfolding in ways neither could have imagined on that fateful day at the auction. When a struggling rancher saw something in a forgotten horse that everyone else had missed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.